Hello, Augies Worldwide. I'm Dave Kassler, amateur radio call sign KE0OG, here with another episode of Ask Dave. Today's question comes from Tom Norman. Tom is KQ7T. He's also an engineer with a bunch of letters after his name, has done very well in quite a few things here. And he is looking at this picture from the February 2023 QST. Since I'll be answering Tom's question a little at a time, let me first say particularly thank you to Ron Winkler, N5 AUA, for becoming one of my most recent patrons. You too can support this channel by becoming a patron, going to patreon.com/KE0OG and look for a way that works for you. Now let's take a look at the figure. And this shows the radio room from the top. He's got a bench around here, and he has a ground station, central ground there, and he has 3 8-foot-long ground rods spaced 4 feet apart. This is his existing station. Now, I would think if you are going to put additional ground rods in addition to one, you want to move these a little further apart, because the sphere of influence of around this ground rod, more cylinder of influence, is such that these other ground rods, they're all in each other's sphere of influence. So you're not getting as much grounding out of that as you might. You might want to put one and then another, and have them about 16 feet apart. Okay? Now, he originally had his line coming up into here, and did not have the isolators that it needed. I suggested that since he had this coming in all the way so far as to get to his radios, that he divert that so that it would come up over here, and you put your lightning arresters here. I really would prefer them closer to the house. And then in like this will take additional cable. But the original cable ought to fit all the way to over here, where he can put his lightning arresters in. Now, he has this coming out to a box out in the trees, and these go to the antennas. I am suggesting that he put lightning arresters here and a ground rod. This is sort of for extra credit, okay? And you'll get a very nicely grounded system, which will help reduce the amount of noise that's in there. Now, one of the things that Tom is objecting to is the 3 ground rods so close together. And I do too. I think they should be, you'd get more out of it, but these ground rods are already pounded into the ground, so you might as well use them. Now, Tom makes a point that most grounding is done underground. And he suggests that they be at least 18 inches down to be below the frost level. Well, now the frost level varies from place to place in the U.S. And if you're going to do that, you would put in a ground rod like this. And it would be, this distance here would be the freeze distance. And then you'd have your cable connected here and going into the shack. Being underground like this, you're going to want to weld that. Now, there are little weld things you can get from electrical supply stores that have got a little thermite mixed with copper, and you put it on top of that while you've got your hole dug, and you do the weld right there so that that weld will stand up underneath the ground. And if you're going to put multiple ground rods on a wire, which is, I would call, commercial best practice, you'd have a ground rod, you've got a wire, a ground rod, about, these are 8 foot, and this is 8 foot, and the sphere of influence on these things is about like this, okay? If you put them closer than that, you're actually losing the grounding ability. All of these should be welded if you're going to run this underground. I don't tend to put my ground rods all the way into the ground because I like to keep my connections above ground where I can keep an eye on them. But as Tom is saying in here, best practice is to put it down further under the ground. Now, he says the ground ring of the type shown should be no less than 30 inches below the ground. He's got an NEC. But then again, that will depend on the freeze level, how far the freeze goes down. If you are in Arizona, the freeze line here will be basically the surface, okay? Whereas if you are in Maine, the freeze line could be pretty far down here. Okay, now, this is important. He says, in his career in broadcast engineers and system design, I've had to solve a lot of ground loop problems. One of the techniques was to use an isolated grounding system. I discovered that even with racks bolted together in a row, with a ground wire in the row, would have AC hum problems. Yes, daisy chaining a ground wire to each rack in the row helped only a little, but home runs of ground wires from the secondary bonding bush bars serving the room reduced the hum to nearly zero. This is why in the league they talk to us about putting in like a piece of copper pipe. It only needs to be about this long. Here's the ground coming from the radio, and here's the one coming from the power supply. Here's the one coming from the SWR meter. Here's the one coming from the amplifier, and so on. And these are crimped on. I use hose clamps, stainless steel hose clamps. They're crimped on to this copper rod, and then that goes to the outside ground. Okay? These are what he's calling the home runs, meaning that the grounding wire for a rack goes all the way to the shack's single point ground. And then all these on the ground rod here, you've got a home run to the actual ground rod. So that is the way you want to do this. I have heard people, even ARRL officials, like section managers, say, oh, you daisy chain this to this to this. And no, you do not. Okay. So his conclusion was that multiple conductors exhibit lower inductance and lower reactance than does a single connector. It means a lot of copper in the station grounding system, but it came as close to an equipotential frame as was reasonable. That word equipotential means that in the event of a lightning strike, everything in the room is at the same potential. With no potential differences between the items, you don't have any of the kinds of currents that obstruct things. Now, I want to show you one of my prizes. No, this is not something I'm going to give away. This thing right here is a Chinese version of a ground test system. Now, you can't put this on any ground rod and expect anything out of it without noting that there has to be another ground rod somewhere. So let's suppose we have a ground rod here, here, and here, and this one goes into the shack. This is connected out to here, and so on. If you put this tool over one of these, you've got a loop. So you've got a loop, you got another loop this way, and so on, and it will measure it. Now I have two resistors here of different resistances. Let's turn this thing on. It's got to calibrate itself. Okay, 0 ohms. Now let's take, we got a resistor in the ground loop, and it's about 1120 ohms on that resistance. This shows the resistance of the ground. Okay, it's like a very fancy ohm meter. And so you'd like put it right there where there is a path. Here is another one with a different value of resistor. Here it's only 10 ohms. Okay, so what you do to determine the effectiveness of your ground, you wouldn't put it here unless there's a loop back out here, which could go out through the utility ground. But you put this on the ground wire after it calibrates itself. You put this around the ground wire, put the ground wire right in there, okay, so that you can determine how good your ground is. You want it to be just a few ohms, if possible. It's not always possible if you're like in Arizona or something. Okay, so I keep that for when I do grounding work. This, by the way, was a gift to me from N6GR, Brad Rich, and is much appreciated. We used this when we were installing an antenna together and checked the ground on the thing. Okay. So I want to particularly thank Tom for his very interesting email that he sent to me that's full of factual information and so on. The only thing that is that this ring of ground wires up here is part of the original installation, not something that I'm suggesting. If you are thinking of putting more than one ground rod in, they should be separated by 8 to 16 feet, so you actually get the full impact of doing that. They should be bonded together, and ideally, as he says, all the grounding system should be buried. Okay? So there you have it. If you would like to help support this channel, you may do so by going to dcasler.com/support and looking for a way that works for you. And until we next meet, 73.